Welcome to Left, Right, and Center, your no bias, no filter take on politics. In a world of loud opinions, we're here to cut through the noise. From White House power plays to global shakeups, we break it down with historical context, real-world examples, and sharp analysis. No agenda, no spin, just the hard questions. Subscribe now and join us, because the truth? It's never one-sided. House GOP budget resolution approved. Washington just passed a budget resolution that could change everything, your taxes, your bills, your future. So, how's it really going to hit you? Whether you're grabbing coffee on your way to work, paying your bills, or just trying to figure out what's next for this country, this resolution could shake things up for you. Stick with me, because we're breaking it all down, piece by piece, no fluff. No jargon, just the real stuff you need to know, and stay till the end. I've got some big questions for you, and I want to hear what you think. The vote and what's inside the budget. Let's start with how this resolution even passed, because it was anything but smooth sailing. On February 25, 2025, the U.S. House of Representatives narrowly approved the GOP budget resolution in a 217-215 vote. That's a razor-thin margin, just 2 votes away from failing. Every Democrat in the House opposed it, and one Republican, Representative Thomas Massie of Kentucky, broke ranks and voted against it. Despite this, House Speaker Mike Johnson managed to wrangle just enough support from the party's factions to push it through. Now, if you're wondering why the vote was so close, it's because this budget isn't just about numbers. It's about priorities, ideology, and the future of the country's finances. And when you mix all that together in Washington, things get messy. Republican hardliners versus moderates. Inside the GOP, there was a battle between the hard-right fiscal conservatives and the more moderate Republicans from swing districts. Hardliners, like the House Freedom Caucus, wanted even deeper spending cuts, closer to $2 trillion, arguing that the U.S. national debt, which now sits at a staggering $35 trillion, is spiraling out of control. They wanted to slash entitlement programs like Medicaid and food assistance even further. On the other hand, moderate Republicans, especially those facing tough re-elections in 2026, worried that slashing popular programs too aggressively would cost them votes back home. They pushed for a compromise, leading to the final $1.5 trillion in cuts instead of the original $2 trillion proposal. In the end, Speaker Johnson had to make strategic concessions, promising the right-wing faction that they'd revisit deeper spending cuts later, while assuring moderates that the cuts wouldn't be as harsh as feared. That delicate balancing act was what got this budget over the finish line. But what exactly did they vote for? What's inside the budget resolution? Think of this resolution as a financial blueprint. It doesn't immediately change laws or taxes, but it sets the stage for future spending and policy decisions. Here's what's in it. 1. Spending cuts $1.5 trillion over the next decade. The GOP is pitching this as a step toward fiscal responsibility. The plan includes significant cuts to discretionary spending, things like Medicaid and social programs. Though details are still vague, similar GOP budget proposals in the past have suggested cutting Medicaid eligibility or converting it into block grants to states, meaning states would get a fixed amount instead of funding based on need. That could leave millions without coverage. Food assistance. A potential tightening of eligibility for food stamps, meaning fewer families might qualify for help putting food on the table. Education and housing programs. The budget hints at reductions in funding for federal education programs, housing assistance, and student loan subsidies. 2. Tax cuts $4.5 trillion in lost revenue. This is one of the most controversial pieces. The resolution extends Trump-era tax cuts, which were set to expire, keeping lower individual tax rates, a higher standard deduction, and business tax breaks. If you're middle class, this could mean a couple of $100s extra in your pocket per year. If you're a corporation or high-income earner, the benefits are far greater, which is why Democrats are calling this a tax giveaway to the wealthy. The major concern? Adding to the deficit. Critics argue that cutting revenue while also increasing spending, like on border security, could worsen the national debt problem. 3. Debt ceiling increase, another $4 trillion. This part might not sound flashy, but it's a big deal because it prevents a catastrophic government default. The U.S. has been borrowing trillions every year to keep things running, and without raising the debt ceiling, the government wouldn't be able to pay its bills. 4. Border security and deportation. Deportation, $300 billion. This is one of the biggest political flashpoints in the budget. Republicans are prioritizing immigration enforcement, including funding to hire more Border Patrol agents, increased deportation efforts, with some calling this the biggest deportation operation in U.S. history, expanded detention centers, and more resources for immigration courts to process cases faster. For border security advocates, this is long overdue, but for immigrant communities, this signals a wave of deportations that could disrupt industries and separate families. 5. Economic assumptions, betting on growth. Here's the part that makes or breaks the entire budget plan. Republicans are assuming that the economy will grow at 2.8% annually, a very optimistic estimate. The idea is that if the economy booms, more tax revenue will come in, offsetting the deficit impact of the tax cuts. But if growth slows, then the deficit could spiral even further out of control. Why this budget matters? So why should you care about all of this? Because this budget sets the rules of the game for the next few years. If you rely on social programs, this could mean fewer benefits or stricter eligibility rules. If you're a taxpayer, you might see lower taxes, but at the cost of a bigger deficit. If you're a business owner, the corporate tax breaks could be a win for you. If you're concerned about border security, you might see this as a step in the right direction. But here's the catch. This budget isn't law yet. It still has to go through the Senate, where Democrats control the majority. That means major changes are coming before anything becomes official. So what do you think? Is this budget a responsible plan for America's future, or just more political games with our tax dollars? Let me know in the comments below how this hits the average American. All right, let's break this down in terms of real-life impact, because at the end of the day, politics isn't just about party debates and Capitol Hill drama. It's about you, your family, your paycheck, your neighborhood, and your future. So how does this budget resolution actually hit your pocket, your job, and your daily life? 1. Taxes. Will you pay less or more in the long run? Let's start with the tax cuts, because that's something everyone pays attention to. This budget resolution sets aside $4.5 trillion for extending or even expanding the Trump-era tax cuts from 2017. If you remember, those cuts lowered income tax rates, increased the standard deduction, and reduced corporate tax rates. For the average American worker, this means you might see a little more money in your paycheck each month. Let's say you earn around $50,000 per year. Those tax cuts could save you anywhere from $500 to $1,000 annually, depending on your tax bracket and deductions. That's extra cash that could go toward groceries, gas, or even paying off debt. If you're a small business owner, these tax breaks could help you reinvest in your company, maybe hiring an extra worker or upgrading equipment. But here's the catch. Those tax cuts increase the national deficit, meaning the government is collecting less revenue while still spending money. If the economy doesn't grow fast enough to offset the losses, future administrations may have to raise taxes later to cover the shortfall. So while you might benefit now, there's a chance you or your kids will have to pay for it down the road. 2. Government spending cuts. Who's getting less? Now let's talk about that $1.5 trillion in spending cuts, because that's where things get tricky. The resolution doesn't list exactly which programs will get hit, but historically, Republican-led budget proposals have targeted social safety net programs like Medicaid, the federal state health insurance program for low-income Americans. Cuts could mean fewer people qualify or reduced coverage. SNAP, food stamps, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, helps 40 million Americans afford food. A 10% cut alone could push 4 million people into food insecurity. Affordable housing assistance programs that help low-income families afford rent could see funding reductions, leading to higher eviction rates and homelessness increases in major cities. Student aid and education programs cuts could reduce Pell Grants, making college more expensive for low-income students. For someone working a minimum wage job, these cuts could mean losing food assistance or healthcare access. If you're a single parent relying on Medicaid for your child's doctor visits or using SNAP to put food on the table, this budget could directly impact your quality of life. 3. Border security and deportation. Who wins and who loses? The resolution allocates $300 billion for border security and defense, including what some are calling the biggest deportation push in U.S. history. The GOP argues this funding will strengthen national security, reduce illegal immigration, and protect American jobs. For American-born workers, particularly in industries like construction, trucking, or manufacturing, this could mean less competition from undocumented workers, potentially driving up wages. If you're a small business owner in a border state, you might see increased federal contracts for security infrastructure projects. But on the flip side, if you're part of an immigrant family or rely on immigrant labor, whether in agriculture, hospitality, or domestic work, this could be devastating. Deportations don't just affect those being removed. They disrupt entire communities, leading to workforce shortages. Industries like farming, where 70% of field workers are undocumented, could struggle to harvest crops, driving up grocery prices. Family separations. If mass deportations occur, millions of children, many of whom are U.S. citizens, could be left without parents. Local economy shocks. Cities with large immigrant populations could see a decline in business activity, from restaurants to retail stores. While supporters argue that stricter border control is necessary, opponents warn that these actions could destabilize industries and create unintended economic consequences. 4. The debt limit increase. A crisis averted or delayed? One of the most overlooked but crucial elements of this resolution is the $4 trillion increase to the debt ceiling. This means the government is effectively borrowing more money to keep running, preventing a shutdown, but also adding to the national debt, which is already over $35 trillion. For the average person, this might seem irrelevant, but in reality, the national debt affects everything from interest rates to inflation. Here's how. Rising debt means higher interest rates. If the government borrows more, lenders demand higher interest rates, which affects your mortgage, car loan, and credit card payments. A 1% rise in interest rates could add hundreds of dollars to your monthly home payment. Potential future tax increases. If the debt keeps rising unchecked, future policymakers might be forced to raise taxes to balance the books. Inflation concerns. If government spending fuels inflation, the cost of everyday goods, gas, groceries, rent, could rise even more. So while raising the debt limit avoids an immediate economic crisis, it also pushes the problem into the future, leaving Americans to wonder how or when it will come back to bite them. Final thoughts. Who benefits and who gets hurt? If you're a middle-class worker, you might benefit from tax cuts, but spending cuts could hit services you rely on, like healthcare or education. If you're wealthy or a business owner, tax breaks and deregulation could work in your favor. If you rely on government assistance, cuts to Medicaid, SNAP, and housing programs could make life harder. If you work in agriculture or service industries, deportation policies could shrink the workforce, affecting wages and business operations. If you're a taxpayer concerned about debt, you might worry about the long-term implications of borrowing more money without a clear plan to pay it back. Ultimately, this budget is a double-edged sword. Some Americans will feel relief, while others could face new struggles. The real question is whether the trade-offs are worth it and who ends up paying the price in the long run. The case for and against balanced view. When it comes to this budget resolution, there's no shortage of opinions. Some see it as a necessary step toward fiscal discipline and economic growth, while others warn it could deepen inequality and balloon the national debt. Let's break down both sides, looking at the key arguments and what they actually mean for the country and everyday Americans. The case for the resolution, why some support it, tax relief and economic growth. One of the biggest selling points of this resolution is its focus on tax cuts. By preserving and possibly expanding Trump-era tax policies, Republicans argue that middle-class families and businesses will keep more of their hard-earned money. Lower taxes, they say, spur economic growth by increasing consumer spending and business investment. If companies pay less in taxes, they may hire more workers, increase wages, or expand operations, leading to more job opportunities. Historically, tax cuts have had mixed results. The 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act did result in economic growth, but it also significantly added to the deficit. Supporters claim that extending these cuts could provide relief for struggling households, particularly those hit hard by inflation and rising costs of living. But the key question remains, will the growth be enough to offset the revenue loss? Border security and public safety. Another major point in favor of this resolution is its $300 billion investment in border security, including what has been described as the largest deportation effort in U.S. history. Advocates argue that stricter immigration enforcement is necessary to curb illegal crossings, reduce crime, and ensure that jobs and resources go to American citizens first. In border states like Texas and Arizona, concerns over undocumented immigration often revolve around public services being stretched thin, hospitals, schools, and local infrastructure dealing with increased demand. Proponents claim that this budget finally addresses those concerns, ensuring that law enforcement agencies have the resources to secure the border effectively. However, there's also a labor component to this. Many industries, from agriculture to construction, rely on undocumented workers. Removing a significant portion of this workforce could lead to labor shortages, causing price increases for everything from fresh produce to home building. The resolution's supporters argue that legal immigration reforms could fill this gap, but those policies remain uncertain. Spending cuts and fiscal responsibility. Republicans have long championed the idea of reducing government spending, and this resolution follows that tradition. With $1.5 trillion in spending cuts, supporters believe it will help curb Washington's reckless financial habits and bring the national debt under control. They argue that the federal government, like any household or business, should live within its means. Many conservatives feel that excessive spending has led to inflation and that reducing government programs will force agencies to operate more efficiently, cutting waste and bureaucracy. But critics ask, what exactly is getting cut? Past budget proposals have often targeted entitlement programs like Medicaid, food stamps, SNAP, and affordable housing initiatives. If those are on the chopping block, lower-impact families, seniors, and vulnerable Americans could bear the brunt of the reductions. Debt limit increase without a crisis. By raising the debt ceiling by $4 trillion, the resolution avoids an immediate government shutdown or financial crisis. While this might seem like an unusual win for fiscal conservatives, many believe that raising the debt limit now, while pairing it with spending cuts, is a more responsible approach than last-minute negotiations that often lead to economic uncertainty. The case against the resolution. Why critics oppose it. Deficit and debt explosion. One of the most significant criticisms of this resolution is that it could massively increase the national debt. Extending tax cuts while simultaneously raising the debt ceiling and increasing spending on border security creates a paradox. How can we reduce the deficit while cutting revenue and adding expenses? The U.S. national debt already sits above $35 trillion. Critics warn that adding another $4,500 billion in tax cuts without a concrete plan to offset the losses could lead to long-term economic instability. The deficit is essentially future debt, meaning that future generations could bear the burden through higher taxes, reduced services, or both. This echoes concerns raised during past tax cut debates. When the Bush-era tax cuts were enacted, they were initially justified as a way to stimulate growth. However, they significantly contributed to deficits and were later a point of contention under both Republican and Democratic administration. Cuts to essential programs. While spending cuts might sound good in theory, opponents worry about what they actually mean in practice. Programs like Medicaid, SNAP, and Social Security are lifelines for millions of Americans. If these face significant reductions, the impact could be devastating, particularly for low-income and working-class families. For example, about 40 million Americans rely on SNAP benefits to afford groceries. A 10% reduction would mean 4 million people losing access to food assistance. Similarly, Medicaid covers nearly 80 million Americans, including children, disabled individuals, and seniors. A budget cut could force hospitals and clinics to reduce services, making healthcare access even harder for vulnerable populations. Beyond social programs, education and infrastructure spending could also take a hit. Fewer federal funds for schools could mean larger class sizes, fewer resources, and potential layoffs for teachers. Cuts to infrastructure could slow down much-needed repairs on roads, bridges, and public transit systems. Deportation and economic disruption. The resolution's border security provisions are another contentious issue. While supporters see it as a way to restore law and order, critics argue that mass deportations could cause widespread disruption not just for immigrant communities, but for entire industries. The U.S. relies heavily on immigrant labor, particularly in agriculture, construction, and service industries. If millions of undocumented workers are removed from the workforce, labor shortages could drive up costs for consumers. Farmers warn that without sufficient workers, food prices could skyrocket, worsening inflation. There's also the humanitarian aspect. Mass deportations mean families being torn apart, children being displaced, and legal battles overwhelming the immigration courts. Opponents argue that the U.S. should pursue a more balanced approach, securing the border while also reforming legal immigration pathways. Uncertain Senate future. Finally, there's the question of whether this resolution even stands a chance of becoming law. The House passed it, but the Senate, controlled by Democrats, is highly unlikely to approve it in its current form. That means either significant compromises or a potential deadlock that leads to another government shutdown fight later in the year. Critics argue that this resolution is more about political posturing than actual governance. It's a statement of priorities rather than a realistic legislative plan. If the Senate guts key provisions or rejects it outright, all this effort could be for nothing, leaving Americans with uncertainty rather than solutions. So, where do you stand? At the end of the day, this budget resolution reflects the ongoing battle between different visions for America's future. Do we prioritize tax cuts and border security, even if it means higher debt and spending cuts? Or do we focus on preserving social programs and fiscal caution, even if it requires higher taxes or economic trade-offs? There's no easy answer, but one thing's clear. This resolution has real-world consequences, and it's up to the American people to decide what kind of future they want. What do you think? Are these tax cuts worth it? Is the focus on border security justified? Do the spending cuts go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. The bigger picture, what this means. This budget resolution isn't just a single piece of legislation. It's part of a long-running battle over how the U.S. government manages money, balances priorities, and shapes the country's economic future. To understand the real impact of this resolution, we need to look beyond the immediate headlines and consider its historical context, economic implications, and political maneuvering. A pattern in U.S. budget politics. If this all sounds familiar, it's because budget fights like this have been a staple of American politics for decades. We saw similar battles in 2011 with the debt ceiling crisis, where partisan gridlock led to a near default that caused the U.S. credit rating to be downgraded for the first time in history. In 2013, a budget impasse led to a 16-day government shutdown, leaving hundreds of thousands of federal workers furloughed and costing the economy billions. This time, the House GOP is pushing a resolution that aligns with long-standing conservative priorities: lower taxes, reduced government spending, and stronger border security. The problem? The Senate is controlled by Democrats, and the White House has a different vision for federal spending. This sets up yet another high-stakes showdown that could determine the direction of the U.S. economy for years to come. Economic impact. Short-term gains versus long-term risks. On paper, the GOP's plan makes bold claims: cutting spending, keeping tax cuts in place, and growing the economy. But how realistic is it? Tax cuts and deficit concerns. The resolution extends Trump-era tax cuts, which means more take-home pay for many Americans. However, it also increases the deficit by an estimated $4.5 trillion over the next decade. Supporters argue that tax cuts will boost economic growth, creating more jobs and increasing overall tax revenue. But critics point out that similar claims were made about past tax cuts, and the national debt has only grown. Government spending and public services. Cutting $1.5 trillion in spending sounds like a good way to reduce government waste if you believe that the government is bloated. However, much of this money goes toward programs that millions rely on, such as Medicaid, food assistance, SNAP, and housing programs. Reducing these could mean fewer benefits, longer wait times, and greater financial hardship for lower-income families. Border security investment. The plan allocates $300 billion toward immigration enforcement, including what some are calling the largest deportation push in U.S. history. If successful, this could have far-reaching economic consequences. Industries that rely on undocumented labor, such as agriculture and construction, could see labor shortages leading to higher prices for consumers. The political chess game. Passing a budget resolution in the House is only the first step. The Senate will have its say, and the Democrats hold a majority. That means this resolution, in its current form, is unlikely to become law without major changes. Here's what could happen next. Reconciliation process. Republicans and Democrats will negotiate changes, with some provisions getting dropped or modified. Expect border security funding and spending cuts to be major sticking points. Political messaging for 2026 elections. Even if the resolution doesn't become law, it serves as a statement of intent for Republicans going into the next election cycle. They'll use this to campaign on promises of tax cuts and border security, while Democrats will argue that the GOP is cutting critical social programs. Government shutdown threat. If Congress fails to agree on a final spending plan, we could be looking at another government shutdown scenario. This would disrupt federal services, delay paychecks for government workers, and potentially hurt economic confidence. Where does this leave the average American? For most people, this isn't just about political battles. It's about how much money they keep in their pocket, whether their benefits change, and how secure their financial future looks. If you're a middle-class worker, extended tax cuts might mean extra cash now, but growing national debt could mean higher taxes or service cuts down the road. If you rely on government programs, cuts to SNAP or Medicaid could directly impact your daily life. And if you work in an industry that depends on immigrant labor, the border enforcement measures could reshape the job market. This resolution is more than just numbers. It's about values, priorities, and the trade-offs that come with governing a complex, diverse country. The real question is, what kind of future do we want to build, and at what cost? What happens next? So where do we go from here? The House passed the resolution, but that's just the first step. Now the Senate takes over, and that's where things can get unpredictable. Unlike the House, where a simple majority, 218 votes, was enough to push this through, the Senate operates differently, especially when it comes to budget resolutions. The Senate's role: roadblocks and rewrites. The Senate is controlled by the Democrats, which means this resolution isn't going to sail through untouched. In fact, we can expect a lot of back and forth, possible amendments, and even a complete restructuring of key provisions. Some major possibilities include tax cuts and deficit debate. Senate Democrats will likely push back hard on the $4.5 trillion in tax cut extensions, arguing that without matching revenue increases, it could explode the national deficit. Some moderate Democrats might be open to negotiation, but the odds of the Senate approving tax cuts at the scale the House proposed? Slim. Expect debates over which tax breaks should stay and which should go. Spending cuts scrutiny. House Republicans passed this budget with $1.5 trillion in spending cuts, but without detailing exactly which programs will be affected. The Senate is going to demand specifics, and that's where the real fight happens. Will Medicaid, food stamps, SNAP, and social programs be on the chopping block? If so, expect Democratic senators to resist any reductions that hurt low-income Americans. Border security and deportation funding. The $300 billion allocated for border security, including funding for what's been described as the largest deportation operation in U.S. history, will be one of the most contentious points. While some Senate Republicans will stand firm on this, Democrats will likely introduce amendments to reallocate some of that funding to alternative border security measures, such as technology and surveillance, rather than mass deportations. This is where the issue could become a deal breaker. Debt ceiling and economic growth assumptions. The House resolution assumes 2.8% economic growth will help cover costs, but economists are divided. Some say that's overly optimistic. The Senate will likely call for a more cautious approach, questioning whether the revenue from growth will truly offset the tax breaks and increased spending. Reconciliation, the key to getting this passed. One way this resolution could move forward is through a special process called budget reconciliation, which allows the Senate to pass budget legislation with a simple majority, 51 votes, instead of the usual 60 needed to overcome a filibuster. This means that if all Democrats in the Senate stick together, they could either block or significantly alter this resolution without Republican support. However, reconciliation has limits. It can only be used for budgetary measures, not policy-heavy legislation like immigration reform. So, the key question is, will the Senate try to pass this budget with Republican support, or will they gut it and send back their own version? If they do the latter, we could see a prolonged legislative standoff. Could this lead to a government shutdown? Another thing to watch for is the government shutdown risk. If the House and Senate can't agree on a final budget, we could be looking at yet another funding crisis later in the year. Remember the shutdowns of 2013 and 2018? Those left federal workers unpaid, delayed services, and disrupted everything from air travel to national parks. If negotiations get too ugly, we might be headed toward a similar scenario. A shutdown isn't just a political inconvenience, it's a real economic problem. It affects everything from federal workers' paychecks to Social Security processing times and even small businesses that rely on government contracts. So, while both parties will try to avoid a shutdown, it remains a possibility if neither side is willing to compromise. What this means for you and why you should care. For the average American, this isn't just some political battle happening in Washington. It has real consequences. If the tax cuts stay, you might see a bit more money in your paycheck, But if they're deficit funded, it could contribute to higher national debt, which affects interest rates on things like home loans and credit cards. If the spending cuts are deep, programs like Medicaid, food assistance, and housing aid might shrink, impacting low-income families the most. If the border security funding passes, immigration policy could see dramatic shifts, affecting local economies, workforce availability, and even the prices of certain goods and services. If a shutdown happens, expect delays in government services, economic uncertainty, and another round of political blame games. Your voice matters. Join the discussion. Now, I want to hear from you. Policies like this shape our economy, our communities, and our daily lives, so it's important to stay informed and engaged. Here are some key questions to consider. Taxes and deficit. Are you okay with a larger deficit if it means tax cuts for individuals and businesses, or do you think we should prioritize reducing government debt? Border and security. Does spending $300 billion on border security and deportation make sense to you, or would you prefer a different approach to immigration reform? Social programs and spending cuts. If programs like Medicaid or SNAP are reduced, would that affect you or people in your community? Should the government find savings elsewhere? Government shutdown risk. Do you think lawmakers will come to an agreement, or are we headed toward another shutdown showdown? Drop your answers in the comments below. I'm reading every single one. Let's keep this conversation going. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video with your friends. Politics affects all of us, so let's talk about it. See you in the next one. Thanks for hanging out with me today. Stay tuned for more updates as this budget saga unfolds. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep digging for the truth, and I'll see you in the comments.